We were on a training exercise in the army, and we set up camp for the night far from any town or road. The trees were dense around us, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant animal call. The day had been spent moving heavy packs and equipment, and by the time we set up our tents, I was exhausted. We ate quickly using our headlamps to see what we were doing, and then crawled into our sleeping bags. Only the feeble light from our flashlights and the faint glow from our bonfire could illuminate the pitch-black woodland where I was sleeping in my tent. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that was creeping in by staring up at the fabric above me. I thought it was just my tiredness, so I tried to sleep. When I woke up, I heard a strange noise, a low, steady thumping that sounded like something heavy hitting the ground repeatedly. I listened carefully to try to figure out what it was, but it was too heavy to be human footsteps. I sat up and quietly unzipped the tent, peeking out into the darkness. My gut told me to stay put, but something else, perhaps curiosity or a sense of duty, pushed me forward as I walked slowly toward the noise. The mist had thickened, making it difficult to see much beyond the faint glow of our dying fire. I couldn't see anyone else moving, so I assumed the others were still asleep, but the thumping kept getting louder and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, my boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. I moved the light around the camp, but I saw nothing unusual. As the cacophony intensified and the mist swirled around me, every stride seemed heavier. The limbs of the trees seemed to press in on me, reaching out in the dark like hands. I persisted, breathing clearly in the chilly air, and as I approached, I noticed something odd. The ground was disturbed, as if something had been pulled through the dirt and leaves. My heart raced, but I resisted the urge to turn around and continued walking over the disturbed ground until I came to a small open space in the center of the clearing, where a massive tree with a twisted and gnarled trunk stood. I walked around the tree with my flashlight pointed straight ahead, trying to remain calm, but as I got around it, I froze. There was a huge hole in the ground, about 10 feet wide and 10 feet deep, with rough, freshly dug edges and pieces of earth scattered everywhere. At the bottom of the pit, something large and dark was moving slowly, and I squinted to make sense of what I was seeing. It appeared to be an animal, but it was too large and its movements were too deliberate, and I watched as it pulled something out of the ground, a long, thick root, possibly a branch, and repeatedly slammed it against the side of the pit, producing that terrible, continuous sound. Hit me hard. This wasn't an animal, it was a person, or what used to be a person, their body covered in mud, muscles straining as they dug desperately into the ground. The hole was filled with other things, 2 old bones, bits of cloth, and what looked like pieces of metal, or what it was, a grave or maybe several graves, all mashed together in one horrific pit. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This person had been digging for a long time alone out here in the woods, their mind gone from the isolation, or maybe something worse, and now they were creating this place, this pit of death. I turned and ran back to camp as fast as I could, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When I reached the tents, I collapsed to my knees, trying to calm myself down. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I'd just seen. We left the campsite at first light, no one saying a word about the night. I never told anyone about the pit, or the person digging it, but the memory of that sound, the steady thump of earth being moved, has stayed with me, haunting my thoughts now. Whenever I'm alone in the woods, I listen carefully, dreading the day I hear it again, because I know that if I do, it won't just be a sound in the distance, it will be close, too close, and I won't be able to turn away. The pit will be waiting, and this time I'll be the one pulled into the darkness. I had been looking forward to camping with a friend for weeks. We decided to hike to a secluded location, set up our tent by a peaceful lake, and spend a weekend away from everything. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful, with only the sound of trees rustling and gravel crunching beneath our tires. We parked, got our gear, and started hiking. The trail was difficult to see because it was covered in dense brush and trees. It was the kind of place you'd only find if you knew exactly where it was. We navigated the forest using an old map I found online, and as we went deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was cooler there, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. After a couple of hours, we reached the lake. It was small and almost hidden by the trees, with a surface as still as a mirror. We chose a spot on the far side away from any possible visitors. It was perfect. We set up the tent, collected some firewood, and got ready for the night. The first night was normal with just the usual forest sounds around us. By the second day, we had explored the area and even found an old abandoned cabin a short walk from our camp. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, with the roof falling in and the door barely hanging on. We peeked inside, but found nothing but dust and rotting wood. It was clear no one had been there for a long time. As night fell on the second day, the forest seemed to get quieter. We sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the sense of being alone. It was the kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound: branches snapping, leaves rustling, and distant animal calls. But then we started hearing something different at first. It was faint, almost like wind, but it wasn't. It was a low, steady hum coming from deep in the woods. We both heard it, but neither of us said anything. It was probably just a natural sound we weren't used to, but the hum grew louder, and with it came a feeling I couldn't shake. It felt like we were being watched, like something was out there just beyond the firelight. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was all in my head. But as the night wore on, the hum became more and more noticeable. It was a rhythmic sound, almost like a low mechanical buzz, and as it got closer, my heart began to race. I could tell my friend was also tense, but we both tried to remain calm because we knew we were far from civilization, with no self-service and no easy way out. Then, as abruptly as it began, the sound stopped, and the forest was silent, as if it was holding its breath. We saw it moving in the trees just outside the fire's glow, darting between the trees too quickly to see clearly. This made my stomach turn, and I wanted to say something to suggest we pack up and leave, but I couldn't find the right words. Darkness. The forest was quiet again, but the unease persisted like the tension before a storm. We barely slept that night, and when morning finally arrived, we were both on edge, so we decided to shorten our trip and packed up quickly without discussing what had happened. I grabbed more wood, but my hands were shaking as I threw the logs on the fire. Every sound made me jump, and every shadow seemed to conceal something waiting to pounce. When we finally arrived at the car, I felt a wave of relief. We threw our belongings in the back and drove off, and as we drove away, I looked back at the forest, which was now only a dark line on the horizon. The hum and movement had stopped, but the feeling of being watched persisted, and even after all this time, I still can't explain what happened that night because there were no ghosts or monsters. I haven't been back to those woods because I've learned that some places hold secrets that are better left undiscovered, and that some experiences leave marks that never completely go away. I never expected a camping trip with my mother-in-law to become so unsettling. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. The most unsettling part was just a sound and a feeling that something was out there that didn't want us there. I'm not sure if it was watching us or if it knew we were leaving. After dinner, we sat by the fire, and as darkness took over, the shadows from the trees seemed to stretch and twist in strange ways. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling and went to bed early in the hopes that a good night's sleep would help. Around midnight, I woke up to a scratching sound against the tent, my heart racing. I held my breath trying to listen, and the scratching stopped. In the hopes of finding some peace and quiet, my wife, her mother, and I chose a location distant from the hustle and bustle of the city, deep in the woods. I must have waited hours before I finally managed to peek outside the forest, which was perfectly peaceful and everything seemed normal, until I heard a faint dragging noise and lay there frozen, too afraid to move. I went back to sleep, but the apprehension persisted. The next morning, my mother-in-law seemed more exhausted than normal, with dark bags under her eyes and a nervous appearance. I remained silent, but I couldn't get rid of the sensation that something wasn't right. Later, we made the decision to go hiking. We followed a narrow path that took us farther into the forest. After an hour or so, I noticed new footprints in the dirt, but they weren't ours. They were tiny and appeared to be heading in the same direction as before, so I remained silent so as not to alarm anyone when we returned to the campsite. That night, the scratching sound returned louder and more persistent, and I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to make sure the forest was completely dark, with only my flashlight piercing the darkness. I discovered my wife and her mother huddled together, going through their belongings, some of which were missing personal items that weren't just misplaced but had been stolen. With my pulse racing, I scanned the campground and saw deep, odd marks in the ground that formed a circle around it. When I realized that they were too exact to be made by animals, my stomach dropped. I hurried back to the tent and tried to ignore the growing fear in my gut. I made up my mind, packed up our belongings, and told my wife that we were leaving immediately, despite her reluctance. We drove home in the middle of the night, feeling relieved as we left the forest behind. When we arrived home, I couldn't stop thinking about what we had escaped. The scratches, the missing items, and the eerie noises haunted me. I didn't find out until weeks later that the area where we camped had a history of strange occurrences and disappearances. The possibility that someone or something was watching us the whole time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to attack, is what terrifies me the most. I still wonder what would have occurred if we had spent an additional night. My grandmother enjoyed the outdoors and always claimed that it kept her feeling young. I was not as thrilled as she was, but I thought it would be wonderful to spend some time with her, so we went out to a remote location in the woods. I remember the camping trip with my grandmother as if it had occurred yesterday. Far away from any cities or people, Gran enjoyed the calm and tranquility. The first day was quite typical. We up our tent, had dinner over a fire, and watched the sun set behind the woods. Gran talked about the different plants and animals around us. Her voice was calm and steady, and it made me feel safe, like nothing could go wrong as long as she was there. That night, I fell asleep quickly, the sounds of the forest making me feel relaxed, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had burned down to just a few glowing bits of wood, and the night was completely dark. I could hear Gran breathing steadily from her side of the tent, so I knew she was still asleep. I tried to figure out what had woken me up. The night was still almost too quiet. I listened closely, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat, which was starting to race. I told myself it was nothing, just the unfamiliar place making me nervous, and tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard something moving outside the tent. It was faint, like a soft shuffling through the leaves. At first I thought it might be a deer or some other harmless animal. But then the sound got louder, closer, like whatever it was. moving around our campsite. I lay there frozen, not sure what to do. My eyes were wide open, staring into the dark, trying to see something that wasn't there. The noise stopped and I felt a small bit of relief, thinking it had moved on. But then I heard it again right outside the tent, just inches from where I was lying. The sound was different now, not like an animal, more like someone dragging their feet through the dirt. My mind raced with all kinds of thoughts, none of them good. I didn't want to wake Gran, thinking it might just be my imagination, but as the minutes passed, the sound didn't stop. It only got worse. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. I reached for the flashlight by my side, my hands shaking. I didn't want to turn it on, scared of what I might see, but I had to know what was out there. Just as I was about to turn on the light, the dragging sound stopped again, followed by an eerie silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something to happen. The silence dragged on, and I started to think that maybe whatever it was had left. Maybe it was all in my head, just me being paranoid about being in the woods at night. I slowly relaxed my grip on the flashlight, easing up. That's when I felt something brush against the side of the tent right where I was sitting. It was subtle, but it was definitely there, like a hand or a branch lightly touching the tent fabric. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would explode out of my chest. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm down. I needed to stay clear-headed to think this through. I decided to wait it out, to see if whatever was out there would leave, but the minutes felt like hours, and the silence was only broken by the occasional rustling too close for comfort. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. No more dragging, no more rustling, just the sound of my own breathing and GR's soft snores. I must have fallen asleep when I woke up, because it was morning and sunlight was shining through the trees, and everything appeared so normal and serene that it was difficult to believe that the previous night had even occurred. I sat there for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for the noise to return, but it never did. Gran had already risen and was preparing breakfast by the fire. I didn't tell her what I had heard, and she didn't say anything either. Perhaps it was better that way. After breakfast, we packed up our camp, and I felt a strange sense of relief as we drove away from the woods. But as we left, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had been out there with us that night, something that didn't belong. I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone or something watching us from the trees. I can't explain what happened, but I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had turned on that flashlight. I'm never going back to those woods, but sometimes in the middle of the night, when everything is quiet and dark, I can almost hear that dragging sound outside getting closer. One weekend, I decided to go camping alone in the mountains, something I'd always wanted to do, just me, the woods, and some peace and quiet away from everything. I chose a spot far from other campers and set up my tent. The weather was fantastic, and the view of the trees stretching as far as I could see was exactly what I needed. I cooked some food and sat by the fire as night slowly settled and the woods got darker and quieter with every minute, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the rustling of leaves. Now and then it was peaceful, just like I'd imagined, but something felt a bit off. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just a little nervous being out here alone. When the fire began to die down, I decided to go to sleep. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up to keep out the night. As I lay there, the quiet started to feel heavier. Every little noise outside seemed louder, the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest, nothing to worry about. But then I heard something different, heavy, slow steps on the leaves, like someone walking. They were slow, steady, and coming closer to my tent. My heart started pounding, and I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent, and everything went silent again. I could hear my heartbeat thing in my chest. I stayed still, too scared to move. After what seemed like an eternity, I listened intently as the footsteps began to move away again. This time, The tight feeling in my chest subsided a little, and I tried to convince myself that it was just a deer or perhaps a large raccoon, even though I knew deep down that no animal walks like that. The following morning, I woke up shaken, but I tried not to let the night get to me. I looked around the campsite, looking for any signs of what might have been there, when I noticed something unsettling in the dirt near my tent. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, trying to keep myself together, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each minute, even though I couldn't see anyone. I knew I had to go. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I stuffed everything into my backpack. As I hiked back to my car, every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just the same quiet woods stretching out in every direction like they were hiding any sign of whoever or whatever had been there during the night. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and got out of there as fast as I could. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I was miles away from the campsite. I haven't been camping since that trip. I still don't know what really happened, but I know those footsteps were real. Someone was out there in the woods that night, standing right outside my tent watching me. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part is the thought that's been haunted me ever since. What if they weren't just watching me? What if they were waiting for something? A moment when I wasn't paying attention to make their move. The more I think about it, the more I realize how lucky I was to get out of there when I did, but that luck might not hold if I ever go back, and that's something that keeps me awake at night, wondering if they're still out there waiting for someone else to come along. The air was cool when I got to the campsite, a remote spot deep in the woods. It had been years since I was last here with my ex-wife, and now it was just me. I set up the tent, started a fire, and tried to push away the awkward memories of her. Night fell quickly, and the forest grew dark. The fire crackled, the only light amid the deepening darkness was softly thrown. I was beginning to unwind when I heard a little rhythmic tapping, but I couldn't tell whether it was coming from a wayward branch or the wind. As the night wore on, I ignored it and concentrated on the warmth of the fire. The tapping became louder and more annoying, as if someone was tapping out a pattern or knocking. I checked outside the tent but found nothing, so I went back inside, but the sound persisted, now accompanied by an odd scraping noise. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to fall asleep because the noises kept getting louder and more aggressive, and the tent seemed to be shaking a little even though there was no wind. I finally unzipped the flap to check outside. The night was still and silent, and the fire was dying down. I walked around the edge of the campsite looking for anything that might explain the noises. As I neared the edge of the clearing, I spotted something out, a shallow hole partly covered with leaves and dirt. I could see a corner of a wooden box sticking out. My heart raced as I dug up the box. It was old, and the wood was damp. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were personal items, photos, letters, and a diary. The stuff looked like it had been buried for a long time. There was also a map with a mark point pointing to a spot nearby. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I saw that the diary had entries about the campsite and the area around it. The last entry was from around the time of our last visit. It talked about someone watching from the woods and the need to leave before it was too late. Fear gripped me. I quickly packed up, deciding it was best to get out of there before anything else happened. As I drove away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods were dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that had been waiting for me to dig up the box. I never went back to that campsite, and I never told anyone about what I found. The sense of dread stayed with me, a constant reminder that some places hold dark secrets to this day. I wonder if the things watching from the woods are still there, waiting for the next person To uncover what should have stayed buried, I decided to go camping at a spot my neighbor had mentioned. It wasn't a place many people knew about, which made it seem like the perfect escape. A peaceful weekend away from the bustle of the city seemed ideal. I set up my tent and built a small fire after leaving early in the morning and traveling through winding, narrow roads lined with dense trees. As I got closer, the trees seemed to get taller and denser, making the road darker. The road eventually turned into a bumpy dirt path, and I soon arrived at the campsite, which was a small open area surrounded by woods with only a distant stream barely breaking the silence. As the sun went down, the temperature fell and the woods became even darker. The day went by peacefully, with just the sounds of birds and rustling leaves around me. I noticed something odd when the woods, which had been filled with animal sounds and rustling leaves, suddenly went quiet. It wasn't just any quiet, everything just stopped all at once. I felt a cold chill run through me, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The fire's light only illuminated a small area around me, leaving everything else in deep shadow. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up to small sounds like something moving outside the tent. The noises were quiet, like something light stepping on leaves. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but with every noise the uneasy feeling grew stronger. In the early morning hours, I heard something I couldn't ignore. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, careful, and definitely human, moving around my campsite. They were trying to be quiet, as if they didn't want to be heard. My heart started racing as I lay there holding my breath, listening to the slow steps. I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping every few seconds. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, hoping that whoever it was would just leave, but they didn't. Instead, they stopped right next to my tent, so close that I could hear them breathing. I waited, not knowing what to do. Every second felt like it stretched on forever. Then, without warning, the footsteps started moving away. Slowly at first, then faster, until they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, too scared to move or make a sound. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to get out of there. I left the campsite and made my way back to the car, feeling like something was watching me the entire time. When I finally arrived at my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my belongings in the back, got in, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, the feeling of being watched gradually fading as I increased my distance from that location. But when I got home, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone was still watching me. The woods had seemed so peaceful the day before, but now they felt like they were concealing something dangerous. Whatever it was, it followed me back and wasn't just in the trees. That night, as I lay in bed, I double-checked the locks on all of my doors, but the uneasy feeling persisted. Outside my window, I heard a soft creak that sounded like someone stepping on a loose board, and I froze, barely breathing, as the sound approached. It was the same slow, careful footsteps I had heard in the woods, but the woods weren't as empty as they seemed. Sometimes what follows you home doesn't just stay outside, it's already inside, waiting for the right moment to let you know you're never alone. And this time, there's nowhere to run.